Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation on challenging your procrastination habits, brought to you by the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University. Today, we're going to be talking about how you can understand why you personally procrastinate. And based on that, what are some ways that you can challenge those natural instincts to try to be more like the student and the worker that you want to be? Feel free to add any questions to the chat as we're going through this. So one question that's important as we begin is to ask ourselves, when do we need to challenge our procrastination habits? A lot of students and non-students use procrastination as a crutch. You've maybe heard or said before, I can only get things done at the last minute. The ways that you can determine whether your procrastination is harmful or whether it is actually helping is first to assess how you feel after you've been procrastinating. Let's say you're working and then you take a break to watch a video on YouTube. Do you feel drained, stressed, or tired afterwards, or do you feel refreshed and rested? You also want to assess the impacts that procrastination has on your productivity. When you take that time with YouTube or Instagram or whatever it may be, are there negative consequences on your work or outputs? Or are there any positive consequences? It's important for you to define individually whether what you're doing is procrastinating or taking a break, and there's a possibility that you're doing both. If your procrastination refreshes you, then it's not necessarily procrastination. We aren't machines, we are humans, and we do need to rest. If you are pushing yourself to work every minute of every day, then you should be taking breaks to enable yourself to work at such a high level. If this is the case, you want to identify those procrastination times, as you may call them, that are actually helping you and reframe them as intentional breaks and plan on taking those intentional breaks. Just the shift of viewing, let's say, a nap or going for a walk as a break instead of procrastination can make that time even more productive, because if you're allowing yourself to take that time and you're planning on taking that time, then you aren't going to have the stress that comes from just thinking you need to be doing something else the whole time. However, if your procrastination is draining you, that's when you need to consider the impulses that lead you to procrastinate, and you need to understand why you fall into these patterns. Taking a break because you're tired, overwhelmed, burnt out is productive. Taking a break for some of the other reasons we're going to go into is not productive. So begin challenging your procrastination habits by understanding your motivation to procrastinate. We tend to see two major ways of framing procrastination. The first is from positive motivation. If you're procrastinating due to a positive motivation, this means that you're drawn to procrastinate by the reward of something fun or engaging. You aren't procrastinating just because you don't want to do the work. It's because there is an event coming up. There's a show you want to watch. There's something positive and you want to be a part of that positivity. The opposite would be the negative motivation. You avoid the task at hand because of the stressors it creates. This means maybe you're doing the exact same activities, spending time with friends or watching a show or movie, but you're doing this not because you're drawn to that positive activity, but because you're avoiding the assignment itself. Understanding the difference between these two and understanding why you choose to procrastinate is going to be essential in figuring out how you specifically should proceed in trying to curb those habits. If you're driven by positive motivation, one of the best things you can do to re-engage yourself in your work process is to craft a workspace that you find engaging. A few ways to do this. One is to choose music or snacks, something that you like and that could make you excited about studying, and use those only for your study sessions. The idea is if you get your favorite tea and your favorite kind of cookie, and basically are using those as a treat for when you study, that's going to be something that will make you look forward to that study block. But the trick is you can only use those items for your study space. Alternately, you can also have a specific album, specific music, playlist that will kind of cue you to begin your study process. And that will ultimately start to create a connection between that album and studying. When you hear it over time, it will make you more excited to engage in that process. Another good way to create this positive motivation to study is to track your study goals using an app, or if you're studying with friends, use a timer app. A lot of times, study apps can make the process of planning more fun, and they act as a bridge between the stress of needing to do work and a more engaged way of organizing it and looking at your time. If you're curious about some of my favorite apps or tools, you can check out some of our previous webinars on the Academic Resource Center's YouTube page. We have one on maintaining motivation that also goes into ways to create positive reinforcement, but also one on productive procrastination. If you're avoiding your homework because it's a stressful task, the idea is that you want to work to make the task less stressful. Easier said than done. But if you have a major assignment and you're putting it off, often what's happening is you're viewing it as a whole, and the whole is stressful. By dividing up a big stressful assignment into pieces, we can potentially create a beginning piece that is going to be easier to manage than the stressful whole. So you start by breaking large tasks into smaller pieces that focus on getting you over the hurdle of beginning your work. If this is something like writing a paper, the first task might be reading the assignment. If your task is reading 100 pages of a book, the first task might be reading the first paragraph. The idea is that you want to take your big assignment, cut it down smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you have something that doesn't intimidate you anymore. And then eventually you're going to turn your study tasks into a to-do list, making the early steps minuscule and easing into larger to-dos. For example, if we have the 100-page reading, you're going to start by reading one paragraph. Maybe you can't turn this whole reading into a to-do list of read one paragraph, read one paragraph, read one paragraph, etc. But you can structure a to-do list that way for even the first 5 pages. Again, starting an assignment can often be the most difficult part. So it's okay to ask less of yourself when you're beginning, to trust that you will hopefully get into the flow after a while. If not, we have some strategies for that as well later in the webinar. It's also important to note that often when we're avoiding a task, it's because there might be a bit of a perfectionist in us. Instead of stressing about the finished product being perfect, begin the first step imperfectly. So this is especially true with writing assignments. Maybe you really care about a final paper, and that's why you're putting off working on it because you want it to be perfect. So start with something that doesn't need to be perfect, like brainstorming, outlining, and just focus on that one step at a time. And again, add that to your to-do list of tasks so that writing a paper is beginning with something smaller. Something I'm beginning to allude to in talking about this task to-do list is to avoid all or nothing thinking when it comes to procrastination and studying. In a perfect world, we're all extremely focused, and it's very easy to put down our phones and we work for hours on end without interruption, without our attention ever wavering. But if you're watching this, this is probably not the case for you. It certainly isn't the case for me. So sometimes it's important to note that we can extend our procrastination because we feel like when we finish procrastinating, then we have to work, and it's one or the other. This happens a lot with maybe small units of, let's say you are watching a YouTube video or even watching a TikTok. You watch one and you say, when I finish this, I'll go do my work. But then you finish, so you don't want to do your work, so you watch another. And you can extend this indefinitely. And part of that is this idea that once you stop procrastinating, you're just working for hours and hours and hours. For some of that, that is quite destructive, and that can cause us to procrastinate indefinitely. So if instead we can think about how we can go back and forth between procrastination and work in a more intentional way, that's going to make it less stressful to stop procrastinating while also making it less stressful to begin working. This is where we get into this idea of controlling procrastination versus denying procrastination. For a lot of us, our impulse is to crush procrastination and ignore it, and we're never allowed to do it. But if that isn't working, a good next step is to instead try to control it. This goes down to the idea that the best plan is a realistic plan. If you know you're going to procrastinate, and you know this based on past experience, then how can you be intentional about your procrastination so it's less destructive than your usual procrastination? The best way to do this is to decide how you will procrastinate before you begin working. Acknowledge that you're going to procrastinate and choose an activity that is easy to pick up and put down again, but something that will help provide a rest for your mind. The clue here, the important thing to keep in mind when choosing your procrastination activity is to choose something that isn't so exciting that it prevents you from getting work done, and to avoid infinite activities without a clear endpoint. The best activity will be something you can put down, pick up, go back and forth to, so that you can be working on that activity the whole time that you're doing your work. For some folks, this might be something like cleaning. Maybe you also don't like doing laundry and you don't like reading for history class. So maybe you read a page and then put on a load of laundry, read another page, sort the next load. The idea is something that maybe even can make you a little bit bored. And when you feel that boredom, you'll go back to the homework. If you want more thoughts on ideas for this, check out some of our past webinars on procrastination, where we go into some specific tips for more activities. You can also use timers to define study blocks and breaks. The idea is that you set a timer to study for a defined period, and then you use the time between study blocks to take intentional breaks, and you're also setting a timer for your break. So that means you know when you're going to take a break, but you also know when you're going to end your break. This can work really well when you're studying with a friend. If you get distracted by talking, when you find yourself talking, if you set a 5-minute timer, that timer can be a cue that you need to go back to work. The classic timer method is the Pomodoro method. This is where you set a timer for 25 minutes and you work for 25 minutes, and then set a timer for 5 minutes, take a break, and repeat. And then after 4 work sessions, you take a longer break of 15 to 30 minutes. A lot of folks like this method because 25 minutes is a small enough block of time that you aren't going to be intimidated, but it's a big enough block of time that you can get some deep work done. If you're having trouble, though, especially when you're starting off with a work block, you could even consider doing shorter work blocks. 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, just to kind of get yourself in the groove. Again, though, the most common note I hear about folks who have tried the Pomodoro method or using timers and it's failed are folks who, on that 5-minute break, don't have something planned ahead of time. They just go on their phone for 5 minutes, or they try to do something for 5 minutes and then they end up canceling the timer and just fall into Netflix. So that's why it's important to know how you're going to take your break before you sit down to work. There's also an idea of productive procrastination. This is when you jump between two tasks that need to get done, one that is more difficult and one that is less stressful. So I mentioned this before with the idea of doing something like a chore as a break activity, but this can also work quite well if you have two homework assignments. Maybe you have a paper to write that you're stressed out about, and then you have a reading to do that you're not stressed out about. How can you break both of those into task lists and spend time working on them both simultaneously so that when you are tired of working on one or feel anxious about working on one, you're still using that time well to work on the other activity? The way this might look is, let's say you have a paper, you can start by reading the assignment, then maybe read 5 pages of your text, then maybe set a timer for 10 minutes and brainstorm, then read another 5 pages in your reading, then maybe set a timer for 10 minutes and work on outlining, read for 5 minutes, and so on and so forth. So you're breaking this big stressful assignment down while also continuing to work on homework. Productive procrastination is something that a lot of folks can completely fall into the task they're not supposed to be doing and completely avoid whatever the more stressful task is. So be sure to set clear goals for your difficult activity so that you're consistently making progress. In general, and I'll be going into this more later, but in general, it can be helpful to have a sense of what you're going to be working on during a 10-minute study block or what your goal is by the end of the day so that you aren't just wasting time mindlessly. As I mentioned before, starting is often the hardest part of an assignment. So ritualizing beginnings, making them more regular can be extremely helpful because then you don't have to think about beginning. You just have set up cues in your day and in your life so that beginning is easier. One thing to consider with this is to prioritize working when you will be in the right mental mindset. Think about when you're most alert, when you're least alert, and also to think about when you might be thinking about a specific class. So if you know that you have more energy at a certain time in the day, but you don't work regularly, then how can you try to set yourself up to work during that time? Likewise, it's important to notice the times of day that you regularly procrastinate the most and try to use those times to do a different kind of activity. If you always procrastinate Friday afternoon at 4 p.m., how can you use that time differently? Something that can help with ritualizing beginnings is to set up your space and materials beforehand so that you don't have to worry about it when it's time to begin. Sometimes we can just struggle to begin working because there's so many logistics. Let's say you have an hour and a half between two classes, you're focused, you want to work, but you have to go back to your room and then you have a snack first, and then all of a sudden you've used up half of your hour and a half. So what's the point? If you can, the night beforehand, figure out what you're going to do during the hour and a half and make sure you have your materials with you, then you can go to the library or even stay in the building where your class is, work for an hour, and you don't have to plan because you've already planned ahead of time. When it comes to using a time like that, it's also helpful to plan for the fact that you'll need to walk to a study space, set up that space. So be realistic in the beginning time for your study block. And then it's helpful to develop routines that can act as mental cues to enter a study mind frame. So that's the idea of, if you want to study between two classes, if you can just get in the habit of, after the first class ends, going to the library, even if you aren't sure of your plan beforehand, the act of going to the library will help cue this study session more so than going back to your room to think about what you need to do. A really helpful tool in developing this kind of study process is habit stacking. Habit stacking is when you choose a routine or process that is already in your schedule to cue the beginning of your study process. The most classic example of this is if you need to start a new habit. Let's say you want to do 10 push-ups every morning. It's more difficult to pull that cue out of thin air. It's easier to try to add this habit to a habit you already have existing, which might be brushing your teeth. You brush your teeth every morning. You want to do 10 push-ups. How can you make it a routine to go directly from habit 1, brushing your teeth, into habit 2, doing 10 push-ups? So using this to cue study processes can be extremely helpful. As I mentioned before, following your mental energy can be really useful, especially if you have a class with time afterwards. You might be in the mind frame for completing an assignment for that class immediately after. So if you can use getting out of class as a cue to begin a specific homework assignment, it'll be easier to begin that process than if you go home, take a break, and then have to pull it out of thin air. You can also follow your daily routines and use a regular habit as the signal that you should begin studying. Often for me, it might be when I make coffee in the morning. Coffee is something I do regularly, so then it's a cue that I should move into another task. With all of these approaches, I think the biggest piece of advice I can recommend is starting small. Begin your work process by doing the small, simple tasks that set up your workspace but don't require much brain power. So if you're really avoiding starting an assignment and you're in your room, it's too late to pre-plan, you're just avoiding a task, what's the smallest thing you can do? You can get out your textbook. You can open a Word document. Consider just beginning with those small physical tasks and then letting yourself take a break again. This goes back to the idea of not denying procrastination, but controlling it. Just do the smallest thing possible, open your laptop, and then take another break. Before studying, develop specific study goals that are small parts of the large whole that you need to complete. So this is another thing. If it's midnight, you have a paper due the next day, you aren't doing it. Before writing the paper, just start writing down what are the specific steps or your specific study goals that you need to complete. You need to read the assignment. You need to brainstorm. You need to outline paragraph 1. Write down those little steps and use that as an early beginning step. Consider setting a 5-minute timer while you complete your first task to ease into working. Again, if you're really procrastinating, setting 5-minute timer to work, even if all that means is turning on your laptop and starting a Word document, and then you follow that with another 5-minute timer where you take a break, It's not going to be significant progress, but you're starting, and sometimes that's the most difficult piece. And then if you write out your study goals as a to-do list with these extremely micro tasks, cross each task out as you complete it. You can also consider balancing your school tasks with other personal tasks, and that will kind of help you stay productive and keep you moving without letting your mind wander too much. The to-do list can essentially act as an anchor. So our next webinar is going to be at the end of November, November 28th, crafting a study schedule for finals. We'll be talking about how to look at all of your final exams and come up with a time management plan. But if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat now. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, and good luck with your studying.